to appeal to everybody, every discipline, the lawyers, the philosophists, the sociologists, criminologists, practitioners amongst us all here. And I was a bit perturbed by colleagues from Frankfurt. Is it Frankfurt in the introductions, where he said that you're not too bothered perhaps about the thinking about what is hate crime. You put me off a little bit there, but hopefully there'll be something in here to appeal to you too. So here goes. I've got quite a number of PowerPoint slides here. It's not a lecture, and if it sounds like I'm getting into lecturing mode, please stop me. I'd like it to be an informal presentation. First of all, the growth of what US scholar Valerie Jennis, one of the early hate crime scholars, called the hate crime policy domain. In the UK, first of all, let me start from here. Really, within the latter decade, there has been, from a starting point of hardly anybody knowing about the concept of hate crime in the UK, 10 years ago, very few people would have heard of the concept in the UK. There has been a considerable growth in the hate crime policy domain, and media interest and scholarly interest in the problem of hate crime. And now in the UK, most police forces have specialist hate crime officers whose job it is to investigate and monitor hate crime. Many local authorities similarly have hate crime officers to coordinate local policy and practice against hate crime. The Crown Prosecution Service has what it calls hate crime scrutiny panels established across all its offices in England and Wales. Probation services have established specific programmes to work with offenders in prison and the community to reduce hate crime offending. There has been a huge explosion of policy work in this area that we might call the hate crime policy domain. And beyond the UK, at cross-national level, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe has been coordinating policy initiatives and monitoring on hate crime now for about the last 3 or 4 years. So the domain has spread considerably across Europe, and international NGOs, such as Human Rights First, for instance, most prominently, have added the problem of hate crime to their concerns. Human Rights First now also produce an annual hate crimes report. I'm just trying to give you a dramatic start about the significance in terms of the policy development and policy focus on hate crime across Europe. So, what is it? And rather than answering this question in one line, I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes of it and hopefully engage you and keep you with me until the end of my presentation. But let me start with some official definitions. These are changing, but the last time I looked on the Home Office website, and Paul Gianassi will probably tell me this has now been updated. But this was one definition on the UK Home Office website that states that hate crime is any criminal offence committed against a person or property that is motivated by an offender's hatred. Motivated by an offender's hatred. I've italicised those words to emphasise them, of someone because of various characteristics, because of their race, colour, ethnic origin, nationality, national origin, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, and that list might be growing. Motivated by an offender's hatred. Hatred. The UK Association of Chief Police Officers, and this has been updated now in their 2005 guide, slipped the word prejudice into the definition. They slipped that in there by defining hate crime as any incident which constitutes a criminal offence perceived by the victim or any other person as being motivated by prejudice or hatred. So now we've got prejudice and hatred as two key concepts central to the definition from official agencies. I'll go through this very quick because this is not a lecture and the psychologists amongst you will be familiar with this material. Clearly, there's a problem with the use of the term hate, and I'm going to argue that it's a misnomer, that hate crime is a misnomer for the crime so labelled. Okay, it's really problematic. And a starting point to unravel this is to go back to basics, and Gordon Allport's classic and influential conceptualisation of hate in his highly influential book, The Nature of Prejudice, where Allport drew a distinction between hate and anger. I think this distinction is very instructive. According to Allport, anger, let me deal with that first of all, anger is a transitory emotional state. Transitory emotional state aroused by thwarting some ongoing activity. Anger is a transitory emotional state. Hatred, on the other hand, is a sentiment, not an emotion. And Allport defined hatred as, to quote him here, I won't do this too much, don't worry, in terms of reading off my slides, but I don't want to lose his words. Allport defined hatred as an enduring organisation of aggressive impulses toward a person or toward a class of persons. Since it is composed of habitual bitter feeling and accusatory thought, it constitutes a stubborn structure in the mental emotional life of the individual. Well, what's the point in all of that? Let me just go back to Allport. I think this distinction between anger and hatred is very useful indeed, this basic and highly influential distinction, because arguably, informed by this, if we can find our understanding of hate crime, informed by our understanding of hatred, as Allport proposes it here, hate crime offenders would be confined to the paid-up, extreme, persistent bigots. And hate crime offences would be those offences in which such offenders target their victims in premeditated, conscious attacks, arguably. Because according to Allport's conceptualisation and others that followed, hatred is an enduring sentiment, not a transitory emotion, it's a persistent, enduring state of mind. What's the problem with that? Well, I would suggest that the empirical evidence shows, there's not a great deal of it, but there is some of it, the empirical evidence shows that such offenders and such incidents are a very small proportion of all of the crimes and other incidents that criminal justice systems, activists, NGOs label as hate crimes. Some scholars, influential scholars in the United States in the field, Jack Levin and Jack McDevitt, I think early on suggested that these types of crime and these types of offenders represent only 5% of all hate crimes. So we have a problem right from the off there with the use of the word hate in hate crime and hatred. Are you still with me? I haven't bored the socks off you yet, okay, because let me take another twist now in terms of the analysis. Let me turn to some highly influential scholarly offerings in terms of the conceptualisation of hate crime. First of all, Jacobs and Potter, and I realise I'm looking at my colleague from the UK here, Nathan Hall, who's going to follow from me.
That's my presentation, I'm done.
Hopefully not. I was just about to say that there might be a little overlap, but not a great deal, and whatever we say, I'm sure is going to complement each other. In their classic book, Hate Crimes, Criminal Law and Identity Politics, Jacobs and Potter argue that hate crime is not really about hate, to confuse us a little bit more, but about bias or prejudice. We have a third concept here, bias, introduced into the lexicon about hate crime, favoured very much in the United States. So now we've got three concepts, hate, or hatred in brackets, prejudice and bias. Fred Lawrence, another highly influential legal scholar in the United States, in his book, Punishing Hate, states that he prefers to use the term bias rather than hate, to stress that the key factor in a bias crime, as Lawrence and others call it in the States, is not the perpetrator's hatred of the victim per se, which is what I've just tried to argue to you in brief, but rather his bias or prejudice towards the victim. Lawrence slips the word prejudice in there as well as bias. And British scholar Nathan Hall, forgive me Nathan, who's sat here, also prefers the label prejudice. I'm not sure if he still prefers it, we might hear shortly. Stating in the opening chapter to his 2005 book, Hate Crime, that, to quote him, for the most part, it is prejudice and not hate that we refer to when we talk about hate crime. So what's going on? We have a category of crime here, a banner, a label with a very tricky word, and it looks like, although this has been adopted and appropriated by criminal justice systems and others, when we unpack it, it really is a misnomer and conceptually very troubling. Let me take this a little bit further, because I think there is, in focusing on the terms hate and hatred, bias and prejudice, we're actually looking inside the offender's mind. And I'm not sure if we'll actually be able to get fully inside the offender's mind. And one consequence of this is that it demonises, it pathologises offenders, arguably, by talking about their hatred in particular, pathologises them as an aberration. And if we take a more sociological approach to this, so we begin to move outside of offenders' minds, we can think of other perspectives. And Barbara Perry does this in her great book, In the Name of Hate. She suggests that hate crime is doing difference. In fact, she refers to hate crime as doing difference. And this notion of doing difference, as I've said in my slide here, situates the offender's mind and their actions in ideological structures of oppression. So now we're taking the offender's minds and situating it into ideological structures, kind of socio-cultural structures of oppression, with ideologies of oppression intricately interwoven into the socio-cultural fabric. To use Perry's words, these structures are deeply embedded notions of difference concerning race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality and class. And these notions of difference, as we'll all be familiar with, are characterised by negative, deviant, inferior evaluations of the other relative to the dominant norm. In other words, what some people might call bigotry, bias and prejudice. And Perry argues that these notions of difference, shared by all of us, arguably, inform the acts of hate crime offenders. And because we share these notions, they serve to legitimise acts of violence against the other. Well, there's a problem, I think, with Perry's definition also of doing difference. It takes us so far, but Perry casts hate crime offenders as instrumentally and consciously acting out these notions of difference in the acts that they commit. And arguably, I would suggest to you that the empirical evidence suggests, although it is limited, that many hate crime offenders, if not the majority of hate crime offenders, are not premeditated offenders who consciously target their victims. But commonly offences occur in the day-to-day to and fro of ordinary life, in everyday life situations, where offenders are often reacting to an opportunity that presents itself or reacting to a conflict or aggravation in their everyday lives, and then the hate crime becomes a consequence of those activities. But let me move on a bit further in terms of the conceptualisation. We might think of, now I'm moving right outside of the offender's mind. I started off in the offender's mind with notions of hate, bias, bigotry and prejudice. I've moved outside now with Perry's notion of doing difference. We might take this even further to think of hate crime as a domain of activism. What do we understand by hate crime? Well, it's actually a domain of activism over a social problem. And I think that in the UK, we've seen a terrific escalation in terms of hate crime as a domain of activism around the problem of disability or disabled hate crime over the last 4 or 5 years, which has certainly dominated the activist and policy agenda. And what this label of hate crime does there, even though conceptually I'd argue it's a misnomer, even though conceptually it's highly problematic, the term hate crime is a powerful, evocative, emotional banner that for activists, policymakers, those working in criminal justice agencies, as well as scholars, has provided a very powerful banner in which people rally together against a social problem. So we might define hate crime as a domain of activism, as a banner, if you like. Further, we could take a legislative approach to defining hate crime. I won't go into detail about this, but interestingly, in the UK, we have no such things as hate crime laws. I feel a bit nervous about saying that with colleagues from the Crown Prosecution Service here, but I feel on pretty safe grounds saying that the words hate crime, as far as I know, I'm looking at you over here again, don't appear in any of our legislation. There's no such thing as hate crime in our statutes, in our criminal law. And the only place that the word hate appears is in our incitement to racial hatred provisions, which I, for one, would argue is a very different thing to hate crime, as hate crime has been conceived, but we'll hear more about that later this afternoon. We do have legislation that some refer to as hate crime laws, commonly referred to as hate crime laws, but the words hate crime don't appear in our laws. So finally, in extending the notion of hate crime even further, I will propose that a further way of conceptualising it is to take a victim-centred approach to defining hate crime. And I'd like to offer some of my own thinking on this, and I hope you don't mind. I've left the last 10 minutes of my presentation to dwell on this, to give you my own thoughts from my own research on it. Let me jump that one. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to interpret and interrogate this. I'll try and talk you through this notion. Arguably, and the empirical evidence, I would argue, shows, and increasing analysis of that evidence shows that so-called hate crimes, in other words, crimes in which prejudice, bigotry, bias, notions of doing difference, whatever you want to call it, figure in the victimisation of individuals, so-called hate crimes hurt more than parallel crimes. In other words, if we take two identical crimes, a hate crime hurts the victim more. Now, this point was made to me by a correspondent on the Boston Globe, who I can still see him now. I interviewed 12 years ago, and he said to me, "Look, Paul, take two," and as the Americans are, I sort of very much dramatise the type of scenario, so I'm going to dramatise it to you. So look, Paul, take two victims of crime, both beaten, lying bloody on the ground. Picture that. Picture this extreme scenario. It's bad enough for both of them. But if the person on the right was victimised or targeted because they're black, because they're Hispanic, because they're gay, because they're lesbian, because they're disabled, it hurts them more. It strikes at the core of who they are, and they can't change that. And all crimes are odious, but when a person is targeted on a basis of their identity, it hurts them more. This is what I want to unravel to you in the 10 minutes that I've got left, because I'd like to argue that this notion of additional hurt or additional harms, additional consequences, to use interchangeable words, is absolutely fundamental to the conceptualisation of hate crime. And because of the conceptual problems with some of these labels, if we take a victim-centred approach, what marks out a so-called hate crime from an otherwise motivated crime is the particular and additional hurts inflicted by so-called hate crime. It's a harms-based, victim-centred approach towards conceptualising hate crime. Can I try and unravel some of these hurts to you? Very briefly. Now this is what I try and do in this chart. Probably only makes sense to me, but I'll try and unravel it a little bit. This blob here in the middle is the initial victim, i.e. the person who is actually on the receiving end of the criminal incident. Empirical evidence shows, I would argue, that it actually hurts that victim more. And I'll refer to that, some of that evidence in a moment. But hate crimes, actually, the impact and consequences spread beyond the initial victim to people who share the initial victim's group identity within the immediate neighbourhood and who begin to hear about the crime, and it spreads much, much further. Let me try and elaborate this to you. A Swedish scholar, Eva Tibbe, in her work, and I'm referring to this Chapman's 2009 book, Hate Crimes, The Consequences of Hate Crime, Eva Tibbe draws on her research work on homophobic hate crimes in Sweden to draw out the consequences upon individual victims. So I'm just thinking about the individual victim first of all. And very neatly, which is why I'm showing it, conceptualises the harms involved upon the victims, ranging from their mind, the sort of psycho-emotional impacts upon their relationships, when she's got love, domestic arrangements, impact upon work, leisure activities, trust in other people, confidence in the criminal justice system, and finally, a sense of resignation. Eva Tibbe in her work has very neatly drawn out in depth, and qualitatively, the individual consequences of hate crimes. And Monique Knoll, in her work, and particularly in her essay, The Ripple Effect of the Matthew Shepard Murder in the United States, and work since then, Knoll has indicated how the murder of Matthew Shepard had profound psycho-emotional consequences upon gay men and lesbian women who were living thousands of miles away. And Knoll has drawn this out in her research work, in her papers on the ripple effect of the Matthew Shepard murder. And that murder, by the way, was dramatised, and the aftermath of it in the film The Laramie Project. Has anybody seen the film here? Very useful, powerful film to watch. And forgive the advertisement here for my own book, but I can't resist the opportunity for a sales pitch. And let me focus now, in the 5 minutes that I've got left, on the usefulness of taking a victim-centred approach to conceptualising hate crime. Let me turn back to the individual, and if I can just go back a few points here to the individual victim, the person who's on the receiving end of hate crime. Hate crimes hurt more, the empirical evidence is increasingly clear. Now in that book, Hate Crime and the City, I present data from the British Crime Survey where I was able to compare and control victims of incidents believed to be racially motivated with victims of incidents believed believed to have happened for other reasons, and statistically control them, and the findings statistically are very robust indeed. I combined a 3-year sample of the British Crime Survey, and the evidence clearly show that for the individual on self-reported psycho-emotional symptoms of victimisation, victims of so-called hate crimes, of racially aggravated offences in this case, demonstrate higher levels of symptoms, post-traumatic stress type symptoms. So victims are asked, for instance, all those who report a crime are asked, did you suffer any of these symptoms? Did you have difficulty sleeping? Were you crying? Did you feel depressed? Were you anxious? Were you fearful of going out? All sorts of questions like that. Post-traumatic stress type symptoms. And on most of those measures, statistically significant higher proportions of victims of racially aggravated crimes reported those symptoms compared to victims of comparable crimes when we control for gender, type of crime. There's a difference compared with parallel crimes. The evidence on the psycho-emotional impacts seem to be irrefutable. Now, at the time, those data were suites of the British Crime Survey from about 2003 to 2006. Thankfully, I was commissioned by the UK Equality Human Rights Commission recently to carry out a repeat analysis of the British Crime Survey, and I have done for the most recent 3 years of data available, merged 3 sweeps again. And the significance of that is that during that period, variables were introduced into the survey to ask about a respondent's whether they had a disability, to ask about their sexual orientation, ask about their religion. So we can actually test out now this hypothesis that hate crimes hurt the individuals more. Now, I can't release the findings until I get Home Office approval, but that is along the way. But I can tell you that, thankfully for me, the hypothesis is being proved and reinforced when we look at other groups as well. And so if we take gay and lesbian victims of perceived identity crime compared with gay and lesbian victims of other crimes, again we can see those additional harms upon the individuals. All crimes hurt. All crimes result in post-traumatic stress symptoms. But the quantitative evidence now seems to be very statistical robust that there are additional psycho-emotional harms upon the individuals as a consequence of victimisation. That's just the individual. Unfortunately, the measures that we have available get increasingly diffuse and far less robust when we move beyond the individual. So I'll stick with the individual for today, at any rate. I think there's an interesting question about what is it that hurts. Actually, what is it that hurts if we put the hurt central to conceptualising hate crime? And my interest in hate crimes has started off with US debates about the justification, the moral justification of enhanced penalties, of giving extra punishment for hate crime offenders. And in the United States, where they're far more wedded than we are in the UK, for instance, to rights to freedom of expression, there's a huge public and scholarly debate about the justification of hate crime laws. Those on the one hand, opponents of laws were arguing that they infringe rights to freedom of expression. Opponents argue by all means punish criminals, punish offenders, but to give them extra punishment for the thoughts or motives in their head is tantamount to punishing thought and expression, because that's how we know about their thoughts. Supporters of such laws argue that hate crimes hurt more. But until the evidence began to unravel, that was rather speculative. This type of evidence demonstrates that it hurts more. But what actually hurts? That's the interesting question. When we look at the in-depth qualitative evidence and some of the psychotherapeutic evidence, it's actually the sentiments behind the crime that produce these additional psycho-emotional hurts. And so, inarguably, punishing offenders more for hate crimes is punishing them for their sentiments and values that the criminal law deems to be abhorrent. And I, for one, would argue that's not a bad thing too. Let me turn finally to the significance understanding the greater harms of hate crime and putting this notion of greater harms central to the conceptualisation of what is hate crime. Because this is not just academic rumination. Hopefully it has very important applications. Clearly, obviously, I don't have to tell you this, understanding these additional harms are clearly appropriate for support for victims, for offering the correctly targeted, informed, appropriate psychotherapeutic support, counselling, psycho-emotional support for victims. Surely, understanding the nature of these harms involved is significant for that. Because victims of hate crime are different, as the evidence suggests. Different in some ways, they're the same, but they're also different in some ways to victims of other crimes. Thirdly, in terms of social justice, arguably the additional harms provide the rationale and a justification for the additional penalties of hate crime offenders. But the evidence of the harms I've suggested does get us into a knot, because as I said, what hurts is actually the sentiments, arguably, the thoughts, the ideas of the offender. Fourthly, clearly and obviously, understanding those hurts is critical for targeting resources by community agencies, by NGOs and official agencies for most appropriately targeting resources. And finally, obviously, I'd like to think for working with offenders. Because I would suggest that most offenders, again, the empirical evidence is very patchy and thin, but most offenders don't appreciate, don't anticipate, don't understand, don't even think about the consequences and the additional harms inflicted upon their victims as a consequences of these crimes. But understanding these consequences is arguably important for working with offenders as well. So my final word, if I can have one at this point, is that given the conceptual confusion over the meaning of hate crime, what does stand out, a common denominator of all so-called hate crimes, whether we use the word bias, prejudice, bigotry, hate, whatever it is, in our conceptualisation, the common denominator is that hate crimes hurt more. And that's the key defining criterion in my view. Thanks for your attention.
I think we'll go down the route of giving a round of applause for our speakers after each. We've got a short time for some questions. People may be looking at the agenda and thinking, my God, we're getting behind, but we left a large amount of time for coffee on purpose. So we have a bit of time.
Well, if I may, can I ask my questions later?
Okay.
Any questions before?
Can I just make one comment? The first job when I get back on Wednesday is to remove that from the Home Office website. I'm not doubting it's there for a moment, but
Okay.
they occasionally think to themselves, which is not good.
We can pull it up if we want to check it.
No, I'm convinced.
Yes, I have a question about the concept of hate and having the wrong kind of implications. Meaning, might it be that hate crimes hurt more because victims conceptualize it, that they are a target of hate? And it would be less harmful if they conceptualize it as being a victim of prejudice or bias, because that has not the same emotional impact.
Indeed, but often the offenders are conceptualising it for them, but in very rudimentary terms, because if we look at the British Crime Survey, for instance, victims of all crime are asked, do you think it was motivated because of some aspect of your identity, for instance, your race, ethnicity, etc. And then they're asked why. And the most common response to that is words that the offender uses. And so more often than not, in interpersonal crimes, the offender is using an epithet, a racial epithet or a homophobic epithet, for instance, and therefore labelling that to the victim. And then the victim's own conceptualisation kicks into play. So it's not just at the victim, the offender's triggering that. But then, yes, that then transfers to the victim then, and who is interrogating that in terms of their self-perception and identity in the context of these ideological structures of oppression, I would argue.
I've entered into some of the hate crime discussion. I'm abusing my chair's position for a minute. Because Kieran and I began to do a bit of pro bono work with the CPS and police in Cumbria on the subject of disability hate crime. And one of the findings from a very small survey, and the statistical significance is nowhere near as useful as the national crime, but one of our findings that surprised us was the number of disabled people who, having felt that they might be a victim of disability hate crime, had moved house and changed their lives completely. Because on their estate they were concerned they would be a victim of anything.
Yeah.
And also then those who had been a victim of a crime that they felt was a hate crime, the percentage of people who had chosen to uproot their lives completely was dramatic. And I think it's quite interesting to link the concept of hate crimes hurt more with the concept of hate crime can actually make you lose your sense of home.
Sure.
And the sense of security and the sense of community. Because I don't necessarily think it's just about the hurt to the individual. That's why I thought it was quite interesting that your rings go out wider. But I also think it'd be quite interesting to think about the relationship to the individual back to each of those outer elements of the ring. Because particularly from the point of view of disabled people, moving in that way also removes you from other support structures that you might use to kind of deal with life. So I think it's quite interesting to try and link that hurt to the individual out then to also the way in which you relate to.
Yeah. Indeed, if I could just respond to that briefly. Yes, Eva Tibby, in her qualitative work, she unravels the behavioural consequences of homophobic hate crime. The British Crime Survey has some variables on it, and but the findings are not as the behavioural consequences, as captured by the British Crime Survey, are not as large as the psycho-emotional consequences. And in fact, there are only 2 behavioural consequences that are statistically significant that we find for identity-based offences. One is starting to avoid walking in certain places, and 2, moving home. But it's only a small minority of the respondents in the survey that actually report those things. But there are statistically significant differences compared with victims of parallel crimes on those 2 measures.
Yeah, I have a question. So I'm sure you've thought about this and discussed it before, but I mean, Mark mentioned this that so in some cases, the cases you mentioned, the sort of hate bias, prejudice, whatever it is, factor is very obvious, and it's communicated very clearly to the victim. So there your thesis seemed to be easy to agree with. In other cases, it might not be as obvious, but there is a suspicion or sort of vague perception from the victim that may be enough to produce the extra harm you speak about.
Yeah.
But I also think that so there might be a lot of what will be defined as this sort of crime under this sort of legislation that are revealed just because you install the legislation, right?
Yeah.
Also to the victims. So because it gives the license to the police, for instance, to investigate in this particular direction and so on. So if you're right then that the perception of this hate bias prejudice factor added to the actual original crime harms the victim extra, then it would follow that the installment of this sort of legislation actually harms some people. Because it reveals to them, it helps to reveal to them that this factor is actually present in some of these cases. So what would your comment be? Have you sort of encountered that idea before?
Encountered it, yes, and it's a very interesting, highly interesting point, and to think through, and it has practical implications as well. Clearly, there's arguably we can argue there's a correlation between the growth of the hate crime policy domain, legislation of activism, and the growth of perceived victimisation. the two go hand in hand. And I don't have any answers for management of that, apart from to refer to a case study of one, a police officer, a young police officer in South London who I was talking to, and in an interview said he'd just interviewed a victim. And the police officer told me that he regretted saying to the victim, as he was going through his records, concluding, "So you were a victim of a hate crime then?" And he related to me that the victim said, precisely, yes, I guess you're right. And then the police officer related the kind of introspection then that he could see on the victim's face, where he could think of these psycho-emotional consequences beginning to develop. So yes, I think it's a very interesting question, one that hasn't been explored, I think, by scholars or analysts in looking at the correlation and the interaction between perceived victimisation and the growth of the policy domain.
Okay, so one thought I had when I thought about this now was that, well, there could be an extra argument for the point you made that, well, criminalisation is one thing, but it's not enough. So
Sure.
you need other parts of the policy. So, and this will strengthen the case that you need something more, because
Sure.
if society in this way actually produces some of this harm,
Quite.
it also produces an obligation of society to sort of offer tools to deal with it for these people, and
Yes.
criminalisation might be part of that, but it can't possibly be the only thing.
Yeah. No, I fully agree, and we have because of the social cultural context of this type of offending, as with many other types of offending, there's a moral, ethical obligation here for social interventions. To me, the harms justified provide a justification for the additional punishment, and I've often promoted that in my writing, and have been labelled, or was labelled, a Blairite for taking this line. I didn't see that as being a bad thing, anyway. But nevertheless, sort of cast right of centre for seemingly taking a line of popular punitiveness. But I would argue that the criminalisation of hate has provided a powerful impetus to the criminal justice system, rather than potential offenders. I mean, the jury is out, and I think, maybe the jury is pretty clear that the law doesn't serve as a deterrent in many offences, and certainly in these types of offences. It's provided a powerful impetus to the criminal justice system to get their act together, which we can see the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, certainly in the UK, have done across the last decade. Criminalisation is important, the use of law is important to label and single out so-called hate crime offenders, so long as, I would argue, flexibility and options in terms of intervention after that are used in terms of rehabilitation programmes and other interventions with offenders, rather than rather than mostly punishment. The other interventions are highly appropriate.
Any further questions?
Just one quick question. The important sense here of additional harm, is it the actual harm, the intended harm, or the probable, likely harm of the crime?
Okay. Well, in terms of intended harm, as I said earlier, most offenders don't intend or don't think about. So they're not instrumentally offending, I would argue, compared to our notion of the paid-up extreme bigot. The vast majority of offenders aren't thinking through the consequences of their actions. Okay. The probable harm and the likelihood of harm, of course, the statistical data are working on averages. So some victims of hate crimes will be harmed less than some victims of parallel crimes motivated or occurring for other reasons. But on average, the evidence shows. And arguably, the law of averages is critical for informing interventions and differential interventions with victims. Does that answer your question?
I was just thinking about individual responsibility in one case. If I could defend my crime by saying this person doesn't care much about being Jewish, so this was the right victim to choose, because it doesn't hurt him more.
Right. Well, I think clearly there is a lack of understanding about the potential harms that that can be inflicted there. And as I said earlier, most offenders, I would argue, again, the empirical evidence is highly sketchy, so much of this is speculative here, what I'm saying about offenders, but empirical evidence would suggest that offenders clearly don't appreciate the consequences of their actions in so-called hate crimes, and certainly don't appreciate the additional consequences involved.
So just just saying, in addition to that, you can relate that to David Matz's techniques of neutralisation. And you talk to offenders, any of them, it's always somebody else's fault that they committed the offence because that's the way they were brought up, or the victim deserved it, or they were different, or whatever. But I think, again, as Paul says, patchy, but I think you can sort of work on the basis that the offenders will try to lay the blame for their offending somewhere else or with someone else. It's never my fault, it's somebody else's fault that it happened.
Okay.
I think if you compare this, like I don't know, like pushing someone out of the window, also the one who did it could think, oh well, probably this person is very athletic and it wouldn't hurt him this much, or the person is actually very athletic and he just jumps out and comes to the ground very well. But I think the point is more the probable harm that could point to the situation and not what the victim thinks or the person who pushed this one.
If the person actually dies, that is usually just by accident. That's usually deemed to be a worse crime than if he survives, and that can just be a matter of luck, right? So actual consequences count in some instances, at least.
Yes, but like I think the probable harm is like the most maximum you could have in this situation. But I would think this would be like the more crucial point.
Okay.